Back in the mid-2000s, Sony's London studio was creating a game known simply at the time as The Hub. Initially, it was a creation that would allow gamers to communicate and interact with each other in a virtual space. This game would provide a space that would allow players to connect before launching into another game together. But it would also be more than that. Each player would have their own virtual space, like an apartment where you could invite other players into. This game would become known as PlayStation Home. It's easy to wrap your head around now, but to Sony executives back in the mid-2000s, it was confusing, fantastical, and dumb. Unfortunately, hindsight is 2020. In reality, PlayStation Home was incredibly unique and ahead of its time. PlayStation Home went through its fair share of development troubles, but eventually released on December 11, 2008. From the get-go, it was futuristic in its own right. It was the first alternate reality game on console and the first alternate reality game in a virtual world. For the time, the graphics were also quite impressive. The game was also free, you just needed a PSN account. There were different arcade games to play and other activities to take part in, and communicating with other people in the virtual space was pretty unique. Sony and their first-party devs utilized Home more fully, with showing ads for Sony games in Home and having other activities available for the users. However, the game had its fair share of issues. Loading between areas was incredibly long, and the higher detailed character models and world meant less people could be in one virtual space. Additionally, third-party developers had problems understanding Home. Because of this, it was rare for these third-party devs to pay to have content or ads for their games in this virtual world. Within those first couple of years, it was evident that Sony did not see much value in Home. However, PlayStation Home was far from done. It was slowly but surely becoming a game with a unique identity. As time went on, there were larger, interesting games, such as this game that required cooperation between players and unfolded in real time. Additionally, even though third-party devs did not see value in Home, other third-party companies did. One example was Red Bull, as they paid to have their own virtual spaces in Home. These agreements with third-party companies were worth millions, and ultimately showed that there was value in Home. But as time went on, Home found additional ways to receive revenue. The most important method was utilizing something called microtransactions. Though microtransactions existed, Home using them in this type of virtual world and platform was incredibly unique. Specifically, it began selling virtual items, such as clothing. Home did not break any records for the number of users on its servers, but there was a hardcore community. Because of this, many users wanted to pay for these new virtual items that would constantly be added to Home. So much so that the devs of Home were quite surprised to see the demand for these items. Apparently, every virtual item that sold in Home was profitable, so in that sense, these microtransactions were incredibly successful. However, it was announced in September 2014 that PlayStation Home would be shutting down. It was later confirmed to be March 31st, 2015 to be exact. So what exactly went wrong? Well, sometimes in the video game industry, nothing necessarily needs to go wrong for a company to shut down a game or studio. And other times, a game can be successful, but also a failure depending on expectations. PlayStation Home is somewhere in this gray area, a success that was also a failure. Sony never stated how much money was made or lost with PlayStation Home. Additionally, one developer who was involved with PlayStation Home commented years ago saying it made millions. However, maintaining the service was costly, so exact financial numbers will never be known. But it was not just about the money. In 2013, the PlayStation 4 was coming out, and Sony made themselves clear that they wanted to be focused on strictly gaming. PlayStation Home did not quite fit into this vision of theirs. Thus, the decision to eventually shut down PlayStation Home was made. Looking back now, it's obvious that this was one of Sony's largest missed opportunities. Ideas such as Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse would not be out for several years after Home's closure, and the popularity and widespread use of microtransactions would be starting to take off around the time Home was shutting down. PlayStation Home was in a world of its own with little competition, so why did Sony never truly capitalize on any of this? I think it comes down to three large reasons. First, there was the market itself. As previously mentioned, many third-party developers do not really understand Home or how it could be used to make money. Similarly, many gamers found Home cool, but for many, there was nothing that made them go back to Home consistently. The second reason was Phil Harrison, who used to be president of Sony's worldwide game development studios. During Home's development, few executives cared or supported the game, while Harrison was a large proponent for it. And quite frankly, the game would have likely never been made without his support. Harrison was quite the visionary and saw what the future could be with a service like Home. However, back in 2008, before PlayStation Home released, Phil Harrison resigned from the company, which led to Sony not giving the same level of support to Home that Harrison would have. More importantly, if Harrison had stayed, he may have been helpful in envisioning what Home could become. Both these reasons ultimately lead into the larger third reason. Prior to and after Home released, it was evident that London Studio and PlayStation Home were pretty much on their own. The game never received large additional funding, and Sony never seemed to put money into research and development into PlayStation Home either. It was the devs who figured out that selling virtual items was viable. Essentially, the game did well enough to continue, but Sony never took a large interest in supporting the game in any meaningful way. This is key to why Home never truly became revolutionary or a golden goose to Sony. Because when you have a market that does not understand the revolutionary product, it is up to the company to convince that market to go out and buy it. Here, Sony never did that with PlayStation Home, or even tried. In the same vein, if Sony had invested in R&D related to Home, it may have figured out other ways Home could make money, or realized how to sell virtual items far sooner than it did. Sony potentially could have made PlayStation Home far more sustainable and profitable, yet it never cared to. It is unfortunate. Home had little competition, so with proper support and research, Sony potentially had a game that could have had the success of Fortnite. Think about it. With Sony's support, they could have created a constantly changing virtual world, one that kept gamers coming back. New activities and arcade modes could have been added every month or few months, keeping the experience fresh. The more gamers you draw back in, the more you could interest in microtransactions. Similarly, they could have created super unique and attractive virtual items to sell. And with proper support, these items potentially could have been made quicker and more efficiently. Sony also could have gone after more deals with third parties, bringing in more revenue. PlayStation Home could have been a golden goose for them, a cash cow, yet it never was. Sony simply did not know nor care to know what it had with PlayStation Home. PlayStation Home was an extremely unique product, one that was years ahead of its time. Back then, Sony saw PlayStation Home as a unique experiment, but one they had no problem shutting down. But now, it should be seen as one of Sony's largest missed opportunities. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.